Good evening all, and welcome. Hunting can be dangerous for many a reason, as I'm sure you'll find out soon enough. Be sure to drop a comment before or during the video, so we can hit our target of 1,000 comments. But for now guys, it's time to get comfortable, and let the darkness take control. There are remote cypress swamps along the Pearl River in central Mississippi, and some of them become inaccessible due to flooding during hunting season. The remoteness of some of these places create ideal situations for a hunter willing to put in the extra effort, and I have hunted these woods and swamps for years, and know them well, even though it's a bad idea. When I was younger, I was confident enough to hunt back in there alone. One afternoon during duck season, a front was coming in, and I knew if I could get to Deal Island, that would be a good day. I put on my chest waders and rode my 4 wheels down an overgrown logging trail in the swamp to the edge of the flood. I waded a couple of sloughs and got to a particular honey hole where I could slay them. I did, and it was good. But when it came to wade back, I got a sense of unease that I cannot explain. The weather was odd, because even though the temperature was dropping and a front was expected, everything was absolutely still and quiet. If you've ever been alone in a swamp at night, you'll know what I mean. But everything is different, when the only things that you can see is what comes out from the cone of your flashlight. I wasn't worried because my light was good, and hell, I was carrying a 12-gauge shotgun. But still, something kept making the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I was being watched, and I could feel it. Sound carries funny in the swamp, but the sloshing noises I was making were the only things I could hear. It was echoing back to me in funny ways, and when I stopped to adjust the strap on the bag of decoys, the sloshing echoes did not stop when it should have. Okay, there's something else in the swamp. No big deal. Some deer or hog would realize I'm a human in a minute and move away. Except it didn't. I would move for a bit and then stop and listen. The sound of something else out there would stop, but it was getting closer. Not normal. The cone of my flashlight made the trees and tangled brush cast long, scraggly shadows that moved with me. I tried to hurry out of the swamp. My knuckles were turning white on that Remington 870, and I was wishing I was loaded with something heftier than a number 2 steel shot. I noticed a very bad smell, like skunk, except much worse, and stopped again to listen and shine my light around. I noticed how the shadows continued to move, but holy crap, I'm not moving. Why are the goddamn shadows moving? A limb snapped, and when I spun around to face it, something that was not there made a soft hissing noise. The beam of my light just ended, in a shape of nothingness that was not there. A breath of stench hit my face, and I heard that hissing sound again, and I got the hell out of that swamp. I was shaking and drenched in sweat when I got back to the truck, and those woods did not feel like my woods anymore. When I say it was something that was not there, that's the only way I can describe it. My light hit it, and there was shadow behind it. There was nothing there. Something in the swamp scared the crap out of me, and I do not want to know what it was. In September of this year, I was hunting antelope out near the Red Desert in Wyoming. I had just shot my antelope and was walking about 150 yards out to where he had dropped, so I could tag and begin field dressing the animal. I should mention I'm about 40 miles away from the main road, and have not seen another human or vehicle since I got off the main road. This area is extremely remote. It's even hard to describe. So as I'm walking out to the antelope, I look up, and about 1 to 2 miles off in the distance, I see this extremely bright light zooming over the landscape and heading my way. I thought it was probably a game warden on a side-by-side coming to check my paperwork and all. No big deal. I keep walking out and find the animal, and look up and see this light dives down into this sage bush, and I can no longer see it. It was about a half-mile from me when it disappeared. I also noticed I didn't hear any engines, if in fact it was someone on a motorized vehicle. I'm mostly confused at this point, not sure what the hell this light is, or where it went, but I continue on, tagging the antelope. It takes me all of 10 to 15 seconds to put the tag on, when I look up and see the light travelling away from me, and is about 3 to 5 miles away from me, going at least 100 miles an hour. It was really zooming away faster than any vehicle could travel over that type of terrain. Also, there are no roads or anything where the light is travelling, so I don't know how it got so fast, and I'm pretty spooked at this point. I field dressed the animal as fast as I could, and dragged it back to my truck. I had a very uneasy feeling at this point. I have no idea what that light was, although some others have speculated it was a drone. But if it were a drone operated by the game warden, why didn't he just come out once I got to my truck? My dad wanted to take me hunting for the first time ever. He's always been very big on hunting, and his father before him. So he wanted to take his only son out to make it a father-son kind of thing. I, however, had no interest in hunting, and was far more interested in spending my time inside on my violin or on video games, which this was neither of. But I relented and went out with him anyway. He taught me how to use a gun, and told me all the tricks of the trade. That we'd be hiding, and we had to get out ridiculously early to make our spot, and that we'd wait, in silence, for movement. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Anyway, we get there ridiculously early. It must have been at least 5 AM, at latest, when we had to make our spot. We sat there in silence, with him occasionally whispering to me that the deers will come out at first light, and that would be our best chance. So there we are waiting, in silence, father and son. I'm not really sure what happened, but it was dark, and it stayed dark. It never got light. About an hour passes and I was bored reading my book, so I turn to my dad and ask him what the time is. He looks at his digital watch, one of those Casio watches from back in the day, and all of the segments were black. I don't really know if that's how you best describe it, but instead of showing the numbers, every part of the watch that had a part to show was black, so it almost looked like it was 88888. So it almost looked like the time was 8888, because everything was filled in, if you understand what I mean. Anyway, he shakes it, presses some buttons, but it doesn't do anything. We say that it's a bit weird and that it should be a little bit sunny by now, and that first light should have broken through. But we sit and wait. I estimate that another half hour to an hour passes, and I'm getting really bored. I know the time we left because I remember setting my alarm, and it should be about 7:30 now, so definitely bright. There's no way it's still dark. I tell my dad I'm getting out, and that I don't care if I make noise because it's this so creepy. He doesn't argue and gets out with me. We start walking back to the car. When we get there, he turns it on to check the time on the internal clock, and it says it's 9:30 PM. We just about lose our minds. We're not really sure what's going on, but we quickly go back, pack up our stuff and leave. When we get home, my mother comments that it was strange she didn't hear from us, as we usually text her, or at least my father does, when something eventful happens, and asks if we didn't manage to bag anything. We just kind of nod and try and pretend this didn't happen. About a week later, we try and talk about it. Neither of us know what went on that night or day. I don't even know what it was anymore, but we were really messed up. How did we lose a day? Where did an entire day go? I'm lost for words and would love an explanation. I am an avid hunter. I go every season, and I love it. More often than not, I don't kill any game, but I just love getting out into the woods. I don't know if you're familiar with hunting seasons in Pennsylvania, but during late November, rifle season is in full swing. It was already the second week of the season, and I had yet to bag any deer, so I was eager to get to it early in the morning. And I did. I normally get up around 5 a.m. and drive to my hunting spot. It's private land that my grandfather owns. Him and I are the only two who hunt on it, and the rest is posted to hunters. And the only others on the land are employed on my grandfather's farm. I had originally planned on calling my grandfather when I woke up and asking him if he wanted to tag along, but the weather that morning was horrendous. Snow was pouring down and the wind was really strong. I love hunting in the snow, but it almost made me decide not to go, so I knew he wouldn't want to. The roads were really bad, so it took me a bit longer to drive there. Normally, the sun would be starting to rise by now, however it was overcast and snowing. Regardless of the snow, I walked up to my spot. It was directly behind my grandfather's house, over a hill about 100 to 150 yards away. Almost immediately upon sitting on my spot, I hear things moving all around me. Honestly, I didn't pay it much mind. It could be any number of things, but it was still pitch black, and the thought that it was a deer had crossed my mind. But there wasn't much I could do. It's not like I can shoot at it, so I just ignore it and continue to wait. It wasn't much longer after that I began hearing something walking just over the ridge to my right. At this point, there's barely enough light to see my feet, so even if it was a deer, there was still nothing I could do. However, I could tell it wasn't a deer. I just assumed it was my grandfather walking to his spot, which is just a short walk from mine, but the lights in his house were off, and if he was hunting up here, I'm sure he'd have let me know beforehand. But even if it wasn't him, it was a hunter, albeit hunting illegally. I still wanted to let him know I was here, so I turned on my flashlight and pointed it in his direction, flashing it several times. Again, even if it were a deer, I couldn't shoot it, so I felt it was better to be safe rather than sorry. Nothing much happened after that. After I flashed my light, the noise stopped, which was really odd. I didn't hear them turn back, so I figured that they either 1. Sat down right there after seeing my light, which is considered extremely rude, or B. I didn't hear them walk off. I just assumed it was the latter. An hour or so passes, and finally the first signs of daylight start to shine through. It's still snowing, and the snow is falling in entire snowballs rather than snowflakes, so visibility is pretty limited. But I just grinned and bared it. I love snow, and even if I couldn't see any deer, I still found the weather beautiful. It was around this time I noticed an odd-looking lump protruding out of the group of trees that was on the top of the hill that separated me from my grandfather's house. Right where I had heard movement earlier, it looked like a mound of dirt. However, it was sticking out the side of a tree, so obviously it wasn't dirt. Naturally, I raised my rifle up to take a closer look, and I could immediately tell that I was looking at the side of an old-style camouflage coat. It took a minute, but it finally clicked. That was a person over there. I just thought it was a hunter, so I didn't know what to do about it. I knew he was hunting on our land illegally, and from what I could see, he wasn't wearing anything orange, which is required by all hunters during rifle season, and I could just tell from looking, whoever this was, it wasn't my grandfather. I sat there for a minute debating my next move, but I decided to call him at the risk of blowing his hunt if that was him over there. So without taking my eyes off the guy, I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. To my dismay, he picked up and told him what was going on. So he told me he'd make his way up. But I decided on my own to give this guy a whistle, to let him know I'd seen him. But he didn't react at all. After a few minutes, I started to walk up to this guy, and after walking a short distance, I could clearly see him. He was sound asleep, tucked in between a shrub and a couple of trees. He obviously thought out where to lay, as I would have never been able to see him if his coat hadn't have stuck out. And as I thought, he had no orange on him. I gave him another whistle, and he woke up much louder this time, almost immediately shuffling over to hide his exposed coat. He had a nasty scruffy beard and a grey hat, and honestly he looked like a harmless old homeless man, probably in his mid-50s, but he had a perfect view of my granddad's home from his spot, and I have a pretty good idea what he was planning to do once my granddad left the house. Once this guy realized he'd been caught, and saw a mad 6'5" guy carrying a hunting rifle less than 10 yards away, making his way closer, his face went pale. Almost instantly he tried to feed me some bullshit lie that he'd gotten lost during a drive with another group of hunters. A drive is a coordinated push through a thicket in order to drive deer to hunters sitting at the end of a designated driving area. However, the closest public game land is miles from this spot, so I knew it was a lie. He just kept on going on about how he was lost and how he fell asleep. He even went as far as to make up a fake name on the spot. I just stood there and listened, making sure he didn't make any fishy movements. I couldn't help but think about what this guy could have done to my grandfather. God knows he had the chance. And that thought pissed me off enough to tell the guy to shut up. And that's about the point where I saw my granddad. My granddad is a tough old geezer. So my first thought was, this idiot is going to get himself killed. Luckily, nothing happened. After he got there, we practically had to drag this guy down the road, where my granddad called the cops, and I called my dad. Technically, this guy hadn't done anything wrong yet, so all we could do was charge him with trespassing and stalking. That was about a month ago, and since then, I haven't heard anything else about him, and I don't want to. I was hunting a big field for whitetail. It was public land, and I decided not to set up a tree stand and just sit behind some heavy cover on the ground. I tried to get to my spots well before sun's up, so I'm not making any noise at first light, when many deer start to move. I got to my spot about 5 AM. It was absolutely pitch black, and all I had was my headlamp. After I switched off my headlamp, it was quiet for about 30 seconds, when suddenly I heard a howl from my right side. It was clear the howl came from the edge of the field I was in, roughly 200 yards away. It sent shivers down my spine. About 30 seconds passed, and I heard a second howl in the opposite direction, on the other end of the field, probably 200 yards the other way. At this point I'm pretty freaked out, but I figure it's highly unlikely anything would attack me. Not much longer, and from directly behind me, somewhere in the thick of the woods, a third howl. I now feel surrounded, and I'm terrified. My truck was around 500 yards away to the left, along the edge of the woods in the field, and down a narrow path that cuts right through the woods. I flicked on my headlamp, took the safety off my gun, equipped my hunting knife, and got the hell out of there as fast as I could. I waited until the sun came up before I went back and actually hunted. I never saw a deer that entire weekend. I presume whatever was howling drove the deer out, and I don't blame the deer one bit. The entire experience was very scary, and I've done a lot of hunting and camping and spent a ton of time in the woods both during the day and night, and nothing has ever freaked me out that badly. I have a hunting spot that I frequent. Not crazy far off the grid or anything like that. Terrain is a pain in the ass, but it's a pretty hidden spot that is close to my house. Anyway, I hunt a lot of small game there and see a ton of mule deer any time I go out. One morning I get there about 5:30 and have some time to kill before I start my hike in. I have an odd feeling in the parking lot, but just chalk it up to too much coffee on an empty stomach. That's giving me anxiety. So I decide to start hiking in, and about 300 yards into my hike, I notice this pile of downed trees / branches / general debris that I hadn't seen before. It was my first time hunting in this particular place on this particular season, so I figured some folks came out and did some fire migration work. I didn't pay too much attention to it until I noticed there's an odd amount of movement coming from it. Pretty small movement, but it sticks out when a brush pile is wiggling on a still day. It was also about 5:45 a.m, and the wilderness just sort of has this stillness to it, and at this point any movement is noticeable. So I stop and start examining the pile to figure out what's going on. I figure there's a rabbit in there, maybe some squirrels, and I figure I've hit the jackpot and I'm definitely going to bag something. I start deciding the best way to flush whatever it is out and still have my shotgun up in time to take a good shot. I realize I'm standing by a decent sized branch, and my best move is to stomp on the branch. If all goes according to plan, everything will freeze, then whatever is in there will dart out. I try to figure out where the rabbit will come out of, get ready, and bam! I stomp on the branch and snap it in half. The pile goes still, and that stillness is quiet. Then a mountain lion, with a bloody nose and mouth, pops out of the pile. At this point I'm about 10 yards away from it. I have a shotgun, but really don't want to shoot the lion. I also don't want to fire a shot off in the air to scare it, because all of this was a pretty cool experience that very few people get to have. I froze, and it was looking at me very quizzically. Then, in one quick motion, it hopped out of the brush pile, ran uphill, and got about 40 yards away from me, and disappeared into the trees. I've never seen something cover 40 yards uphill in such a fast and graceful way. One of the coolest things I've ever gotten to experience. I went to check out the brush pile when it left, and sure enough, it was feasting on a mule deer. Still my favorite story from whenever I was out in the woods. I was turkey hunting. Full gobbler, I think, if I recall correctly. Anyway, I was walking to my spot in my orange, and had just started to tuck it away. For non-hunters, turkey can see colour, so the regulation states that hunters need to wear 250 square inches of orange while moving, but you can take it off and just wear regular camo when you get to your spot. In my management zone, you just need to put some orange somewhere within 15 feet of you to let other hunters know you're in the area, and to be vigilant. I finish up stowing my orange away, and sit down and start using my call. I eventually hear something coming from away, and it's calling back. As the sound gets closer, I start to think that maybe it's too big to be a turkey. Maybe it's a small flock. I go to call again, and a shot goes off far too close for me, and I shit bricks. I had not seen anyone come in, nor had I seen any orange hanging in a tree to signify someone else was hunting there. so I thought I was pretty isolated. Another shot goes off, closer, and the chucking call starts back up. Now I'm certain of two things. One, there is no turkey, as they would have scattered because of the shots. And two, I have an idiot out here trying to stalk me thinking I'm a turkey, and he's following my calls and shooting blind, or seeing me move and assuming I'm a bird. Either way, I'm shitting bricks, and I decide to yell out, "Hold but, I'm not a bird, quit shooting," and another shot goes off. I'm terrified to so much as wiggle a finger at this point, because I can't see this guy, but I know he's shooting in my direction and trigger happy. I'm sitting there hollering that I'm a human and contemplating the idea of moving to grab my orange and wave it to signify to this guy that he's shooting at a person, when a third shot goes off, and I actually hear the BBs hitting shit near me. I hit the deck and laid flat for 2 hours, absolutely crapping myself until I was sure they were gone. For any non-hunters out there, this is a known issue within turkey hunting, because you need to remove your visibility orange, and because you're calling as an attractant, some assholes will attempt to stalk what they think is a turkey, and end up stalking another hunter, and in their idiot fervour, they shoot at the first thing that moves. Say another hunter itching their nose, a good number of people had died that way, and it made me swear off turkey hunting. I live in Michigan and regularly go out trapping or coyote hunting. One day, I'm taking a long-time friend hunting for the first time. He lived out of state, so he wasn't familiar with the area and its types of people and habits, so to speak. It was wintertime in Michigan, and at the time we were actually having one of our coldest winters on record. We were walking along, and unfortunately, the coyote spot I usually used had now become useless after so many uses of traps and shots taken there. So we went a bit deeper to look for a better spot. The coyotes had a den in some lowlands and thick brush. I don't usually go out there, but I didn't want my friend's first hunt to be boring, so we pressed on. After a bit of walking, my friend noticed a blood trail, and I assumed another hunter hit and wounded one. I figured we would track to make sure it didn't suffer, so we followed the blood trail. The strange part was we didn't notice any tracks, and it was winter, so tracks would be easy to spot. However, when we reached the source, we ended up finding something a lot more gruesome. We came across the dead bodies of a man and a woman. The man had a crossbow bolt in his stomach and looked like he had been stabbed. The woman was stabbed much worse and looked like she had been sexually assaulted. Needless to say, we called the police. Additionally, it seems the suspect was caught, although not by law enforcement. It turns out the girl he murdered was his ex-wife, who ended up divorcing him, and the guy was her new boyfriend. The guy who killed them actually ended up running back into the lowland swamp area, where he had kind of a lean setup, where he was found dead from frostbite, and drinking far too much, and passing out in the cold. Drugs also seem to have been involved. The crossbow bolt that the couple was shot with actually had high amounts of some kind of venom, or would it be poison, on the tip, although it seemed to be a paralyzing one. Also, due to the heavy amount of snowfall, the blood trail was extremely visible even in low light. But according to the police report, it seems like the conclusion was the guy was hit by the bolt, became unable to move, and the woman ended up attempting to drag him to safety with him, trailing behind her, thus running over her tracks for the most part, which might explain why we were unable to see what would otherwise be easily identifiable footprints. Although, because he was a fairly larger guy, she wasn't able to drag him for long, until her ex caught up. I've never been back to those woods since, and now when I go out, I always wear body armor underneath my vest, and make sure I'm not alone. This happened to my grandfather about 50 years ago. He was an avid hunter, but after this incident, his love of hunting pretty much stopped. He always tells this story with a chill in his eye. He explains that many years ago, he was out hunting in the forest for white-tailed deer. He had a really good spot, and was just waiting on the ground under a tarp for something to happen. Whilst he was waiting, did he notice something unusual in the background? There was talking, and before he knew it, 5 men, all dressed in suits and shades, started walking through the forest. They were all silent. They didn't look anywhere except straight ahead. They walked, and he was unsure what people were doing in such a remote area. He didn't say anything at first, but feeling very creeped out, thinking that maybe they were government officials and that there was something very wrong in this area, he got out from his hiding place and started approaching them. That's when they all stopped and turned and looked at him in unison. As he approached them and was giving them a greeting, did they all vanish into thin air. Bear in mind that this was in the early hours of the morning, and there was plenty of sunlight. He wasn't on any drugs or alcohol or medication, and saw them as clear as day just vanish in front of him. He hightailed it back, drove home, never hunted again. I don't blame him. I get freaked out just thinking about it. When I was younger, my dad told me this story from a hunting trip he went on in the Appalachian Mountains. He spent the majority of the day without seeing a thing, and was ready to pack up and leave when a white-tailed deer showed up. He shot it, but it ran away, and he had to go and track it down. About a half hour later he came across the downed animal, after following a very distinct blood trail. Shortly after he began field dressing the deer, a group of 4 armed men in regular clothing walked through the forest and approached him. He always describes them as mountain men when he tells the story. Anyway, one of the men told my dad the deer was their kill, and that he should leave. My dad, never one for confrontation, argued that he had just shot it, and that he followed the blood trail all the way to the deer. At this point, the men unslung their rifles and pointed them at my dad, telling him these are their mountains, and that they'll be taking the deer. They made claims that people have hunting accidents all the time, and how unfortunate it would be for him to have one. He left and called the police, which resulted in the responding officer telling my dad that there was nothing they could do about it, because they don't want to have a fight on their hands with the locals. East Tennessee, ladies and gentlemen. This happened to my father-in-law about 10 years ago, at our hunting camp in Alabama. It popped into my head as we are heading there tomorrow for a few days of deer hunting. He told me to go ahead and share his story. It's short, but as I get a little creeped out in the woods, this would have freaked me out. So, as some people probably know, we get an hour or so before light and climb into a tree stand, or ladder leading up to a seat in a tree, usually fairly deep into the woods to hunt. This foggy morning, my father-in-law has been in his stand for a couple of hours. It was getting late, and he was reading a book while he waited for something to happen. Out of the fog he hears a woman's voice, much closer than anyone should have been to him at the time. She is calling out, "Hunter! Oh, Hunter!" Very sing-songy, like a mother calling her child for dinner, as he played outside. Now, as I said, He's pretty deep in the woods, and there are sticks and dried leaves everywhere. You generally make a pretty good racket going into your stand, which is why we have to get out so early. Not only that, but in order to know where he was and spot him camouflaged in a tree, she must have seen his light when he walked out, followed him into the woods, and waited hours before calling to him. He first thought the woman was calling someone called Hunter, perhaps her son. She called again and he realized that he is Hunter. So he turns around, peers around the trees and sees a young woman. She, in very few words and halting speech, explains that something is wrong with her hot water heater and asks if he can come and take a look. Now, the strangeness of the situation hadn't set in yet, and he's a give a shirt off his back kind of guy. Not to mention 6'2" and nearly 300 pounds with a gun. So he wasn't too worried about this small woman, and starts getting down the tree to have a look. He follows her back to her mobile home, which borders our hunting lands, and are probably about a 10-minute walk away. And she walks inside and leaves the door open. He's trailing behind a little, and he gets to the door, kind of knocks, and sticks his head in to say hello. No answer. Where he entered is a laundry room, and he can see there in the room is a hot water heater, and water is just pouring out of a valve at the bottom, just absolutely pouring onto the floor. He walks over, turns the valve off, sticks his head into the house and says hello again, and nothing. No answer. The house seems empty. Empty of people anyway, but it's a disaster inside. At this point, he's starting to see how strange it all is, and decides that this is just the sort of situation that gets you robbed and murdered, and nopes the hell out of there and hurried back to our cabin. Now we have hunted this land for years since, and have never seen anyone at this place. Although, until this season, it has shown obvious signs of being lived in. So every year I pass by her place, and I always think to myself that I definitely don't want to meet the lady in the trailer with messed up plumbing who may or may not have had nefarious intentions for my father-in-law. This happened after my hunt for some whitetail in northern Michigan. I was leaving the woods and heading to my car, preparing myself for the long ride home. The sun was setting and the air was crisp, and the smell of fall was in the air. As I got to my car, I heard some rustling in the brush on the other side of the trail I was parked on. Thinking it was an animal, I looked across and saw a guy standing there. He was slightly swaying from side to side, not a drunk sway, but more of an impatient standing in line for a long time type of sway. "Hey man, are you lost?" I said. He didn't answer, but he gave the creepiest smirk and tilted his head back slightly, without taking his eyes off me. Needless to say, I was creeped the hell out. My gun made me feel protected, but as I loaded my pack and my shotgun into the car, I didn't take my eyes off him, and he kept his locked on mine. I kept my 9mm on me in case he tried something, and I was parked parallel to the trail, so when I got in the car I could still see him. I drove and checked my mirror, and he was in the middle of the trail just walking in my direction. That was the creepiest day hunting I have ever had. When I was 15, I was hunting in the Colorado Rockies for elk. We were around 12 to 15 miles up a mountain with no cell reception or anything. I'd been there twice before this incident took place, and I was out with my uncle when we heard a woman scream. Curious and a little frightened, we decided to go check it out. We were hiking over a ridge for around 10 minutes, when we saw bloody clothing and a t-shirt and shorts and nothing else. No footprints or anything to indicate where the scream had gone. We hightailed it back to camp and began to pack up, it being our last 2 days. We packed out the next day and went to the ranger's service and gave them the location of the scene. And that was it. They asked a few questions and said they'd follow up, but we never heard anything. I can't explain this, but we were hunting 25 years ago, and we found a white-tailed deer frozen into a river by his feet. This is where it gets weird. This animal was cut in half. His rear end was missing, but it was how clean the cut was. It had looked like it was done with a bandsaw. Also, the animal had been gutted like it was cleaned out with an ice cream scoop. Completely cleaned. No blood trail, no guts, just half a frozen deer in the ice, eyes wide open, missing its entire backside. I've got no explanation for this, and I really don't think I even want to think about it anymore, as I still can't even fathom what happened. I used to be a field appraiser. I was at a parcel and was doing data collection for some 20-foot shipping containers that had appeared in the last several months. It was obvious they were being used as hunting cabins during hunting season. As I was finishing up, I turned around to walk back to my vehicle, and standing right there were 2 hunters. They were dressed head to toe like snipers, with ghillie suits on and large caliber rifles pointing right at me. That, as you can imagine, scared the heck out of me. Of course, they were mouthy and pissed off towards me. Then, when they found out what I was doing, that escalated things even more. I don't blame them, really. They saw me walking around looking and measuring everything, and taking photos of the place. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I really did hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. Hunting stories, I think I've done it once before. Maybe never before, I'm not entirely sure, but I know it's something I hardly ever do. So I hope you did enjoy this collection of stories. If there's a story that you would like to share, to have it potentially read in future, feel free to send it to my email or post it on my Reddit page. Either are fine. And it should make it onto a video, assuming it has a lot of detail, punctuation and paragraphing. But for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.